happy to be here today to share some ideas with you, but also to listen to what questions you have and what ideas you have. Let's get started. If you haven't been to my website, I encourage you to go there. You'll see copies of many of my presentations, a lot of the research papers that I've published and book chapters and things like that are on my website. I have a lot of short pieces that I've written with case studies. Also a lot of helpful guides, Excel spreadsheets that I've made for analyzing scores as it relates to the CAS and all the achievement tests and things like that. So I encourage you to take a look at that, and we might wind up talking about that a little bit more. So I like to start with the big picture. In other words, I'm teaching using simultaneous processing approach, meaning simultaneous processing is seeing things as a whole, right? So I want to give you that perspective. So where are we starting here? I think that intelligence testing is so critical to what we do as school psychologists, because it's really a pivotal part in our comprehensive assessments. But in this next hour, or a little less, during this presentation, I want to help you understand the history and the context within which intelligence tests were created, and as we're still using them. And there's really a lot of good news to what we're going to talk about today. That is that we really can do better if we embrace what I've called second generation measures. And we'll go through that quite with some detail. And how we can do better, we can have tests that are more socially just, because that's critically important. We want tests that are effective for SLD determination, because so much of what we do is trying to answer the question of why the student doesn't learn. And then the question that comes from that is, what are you going to do about it? We need to be able to help people understand what, in fact, they can do to help a student learn better. So that's what we're going to go through today. So this is the basic outline. We'll talk about traditional IQ tests just a little bit. We'll talk about measuring psychological processes and some of the advantages of that. Let's talk about what we have. I began as a professional musician. That was my first profession. And when I was teaching guitar, I realized that some students learn better than others. And I really wanted to understand how people learned. Of course, that's what past theory is, right? It's really a theory of learning. We might call it intelligence or ability, but really the implication of those concepts is how people learn. So started out working as a musician and teaching, and then I started working as a school psychologist. I noticed that the tests that I was using, here's the actual school I worked in, Champaign Elementary School in New York on Long Island. But I noticed that the questions on my intelligence tests, WISC-R, were very similar to the questions on my achievement tests that I was giving. And something about that didn't make sense to me. And I think today that that's one of the fundamental problems with our tests that we call intelligence tests. And that is they demand too much knowledge. So think about traditional learning disabled child. They're not reading very well, they're not learning very well. You sit down and give them a WISC or a Woodcock-Johnson or differential ability scales or Stanford-Binet, and you're asking vocabulary questions. Well, how do you get vocabulary? It's from reading, right? A big part of vocabulary acquisition is through reading. And then they get a lower IQ score because they don't have enough vocabulary. So we think they're less smart because they don't have the knowledge to answer the vocabulary questions. Or in the Woodcock-Johnson, even phonemic, phonological skills, or academics like math. These kind of issues are the fundamental weakness in our traditional intelligence tests. Not the only weakness, but a fundamental weakness. And of course, this is really a social justice problem for me, because you know the kind of kids who do poorly on these tests of achievement are kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. So this is a real problem, because ability tests should measure thinking, not knowing. We're going to talk more about that. But let's back up for a second. Why do our intelligence tests have the content they have? Where did that come from? How did we get to this place? Well, if you go back and you read the history of intelligence testing, obviously you start off with Binet and even further back than that, but I think the real impact was from the work of the US military more than 100 years ago, when they developed the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And you can go to Google Books and get Army Mental Tests by Yoakum and Yerkes. It's free, it's a PDF, and you can look at all the stuff I'm going to show you here. But in the development of those tests that were used in World War I, think about that. They had what they call the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And those tests were developed, tried out, and deemed appropriate for use in aid in segregating and eliminating the mentally incompetent, classifying men according to their mental ability, and assist in selecting competent men for responsible positions. That was the conclusion in 1917. Now, those tests became the Wechsler scales, because Wechsler was in the military, and he used to use the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And when you look at Yoakum and Yerkes' book, you're going to see the WISC, because really that's where it comes from. Block design, object assembly, mazes, vocabulary, similarities, arithmetic, all that stuff. It was conceptualized as verbal and quantitative and so-called nonverbal tests. So you can see whose book I have a copy of here. And, you know, Wechsler's verbal and nonverbal tests came from the work of Yoakum and Yerkes. Wechsler didn't just dream this stuff up himself. By today's standards, we would call it copyright infringement. So why do we have nonverbal tests? Because when people like this, Antonino Miranda, came to the US and landed here at Ellis Island, they would have asked him questions, and I know he wouldn't have responded well. They put a chalk X on his lapel because we didn't let low ability people in the country at that time. And I know how they would have given him a test like this, which is object assembly from the WISC, and he would have solved it just like that, and they would have said to him, go to Little Italy where you belong, which is what he did. He lived in this building on 111 Mulberry Street. He was my grandfather. He never spoke English very well, didn't go beyond 8th grade in Italy, but he was smart enough to have his own grocery store and be successful. That's why they had the nonverbal scales. In fact, Yoakum and Yerkes wrote, the men who fail in alpha, which would have been my grandfather, was sent to beta, the nonverbal, in order that injustice by reason of a familiarity with English may be avoided. So here's the thing, I was never taught that the verbal scale on the Wechsler posed a social justice problem. I should have been taught that, but I wasn't. because we just accepted, because the two letters IQ came after V, that there was such a thing as verbal IQ or verbal intelligence. Now, let's take another step. I'm going to show you a little, it's not Saturday Night Live research update, but it's certainly a research update that you need to be aware of. So here's the thing. What was Wechsler's definition of intelligence? The aggregate or global capacity of the individual to think, act purposely, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with his environment. Very sexist, by the way, his environment. But you know, Wechsler was a firm believer in G throughout his whole lifetime. He never believed in verbal or nonverbal types of intelligences, even though we have been taught to think of the tests in those ways. But here's the really important thing that you need to know about. There's a lot of research that has been done by people that I've known for 30 years, like Gary Canavay, Marley Watkins, I've known him for 40 years. People that I know, and more importantly, people that I trust. I've had many conversations with these guys, and the research that they're doing is really important. And what they have been finding is that the notion of general ability has good empirical support. However, the notion of interpreting at levels beyond G has not had sufficient support. So said, as they've written, the small portions of variance uniquely captured by scales and subtests render those scores of questionable interpretable value. This is a very important finding that's been replicated in this particular study. They went back and reanalyzed the original data from John Carroll's book, you know, the big book that some people call a Bible. I don't call it that, but some people do, where all these different studies were, you know, merged. And what did Benson and Bijou and Brian McGill and Stefan DeBronski found? They found that that this multiple dimensional approach, that's basically CHC, does not have enough specific variance after general intelligence has been partialed out to be interpreted. That's a very powerful finding. And I just give you this list. This is just a partial list of all the studies that they've done with all the different kinds of tests. The WISC Spanish, the WISC this, the WISC Canadian, the differential ability scales, on and on and on and on. They always get the same result. You should not interpret anything beyond the G score, except for one test, and that's this study on cognitive assessment system, where they wrote, quote, compared to WISC-4, WACE-4, Stanford Binet 5, RIAS, WASI, RIT, and the CAS subtest had less variance proportion to the general factor and greater proportions of variance proportion to the first order PASS factor. So I haven't done any of this research. I gave Gary Canavay my standardization sample data to do this study. And I gave it to him because I know that he would tell me what he got, and I could trust that. If he said, no, Jack, you really can't interpret anything beyond G, I'd be very depressed. But that's not what happened. So you can go read all these studies, and I encourage you to do that. Now, one of the arguments that I think we have to make maybe not argument, but considerations that we have to think about is this whole issue of test content. All the ability tests shown here all have a tremendous amount of knowledge in them. As I've already said to you, I think a good ability test has to measure thinking, not confounded by what a person knows. I actually developed this little thinking and knowing continuum to kind of put this in perspective. So on the right-hand side, you see the Stanford Achievement Test, any achievement test. They're designed to measure what a person knows. That's a good thing. Steve Pfeiffer's test gets at a person, how much a person knows, but also a bit about how a person thinks. That's why I'm convinced that the Pfeiffer assessments are actually better than the traditional achievement tests. I could talk about that more later. Then you have the cognitive portion of the Woodcock and the Whisk and the Stanford-Binet and all those other tests in the middle, because they're confounded. They measure thinking, but confounded by knowing. That's a problem. The only tests that measure thinking that's not confounded by knowing would be my cognitive assessment system, Wechsler nonverbal scale, the Bruce Bracken and Steve McCallum's unit, any of the nonverbal tests like my Naglieri nonverbal, any of those where we don't have all the vocabulary and arithmetic stuff, you know? And again, if you go back and read like Joe Matarazzo's book, which is the book that I learned about intelligence testing from in the mid-70s. I've known Joe for a long time. He's a really terrific guy. And he wrote in that book that vocabulary is influenced by educational opportunities. Well, we know that, right? Still. And that referring to arithmetic subtests, its merits are lessened by the fact that it's influenced by education. So even though all these people have said these tests that we call gold standards, like a Whisk 5, are considered like the way of measuring intelligence, they're confounded by knowledge. And that creates an interesting problem, because here's, some people say, this is the counter argument to me. Some people say, well, you have to have verbal tests because verbal intelligence, which I reject that notion, but verbal intelligence is a good predictor of achievement. To me, that's a circular argument, right? Because if you have vocabulary and arithmetic on your intelligence test and you have vocabulary and arithmetic on your achievement test, of course they're going to correlate. It's criterion contamination. You're asking the same question in two different instruments. And just because one says it's an intelligence test and the other says it's an achievement test, we think they're different, but they're not. They're at best, horribly confounded. So anyway, I want to look and see, does pass correlate with achievement as well as a traditional Whisk, right? Because really that's probably a basic validity question. But I have a problem because though the Whisk and everything else is confounded, that gives them an advantage. So when I started doing this research years ago, I thought, man, I don't know what's going to happen, but I got to look. And I did. And in this image that you see here, there's two columns. And what we're looking at here is the average correlation between, let's look at the Whisk 5, the top part here for a second. The Whisk 5, this is the average of all the correlations for the separate scales with the Wyatt 3, 200 kids. And what I did in the rightmost column is just take the average excluding the most egregious, the verbal comprehension scale. Now I know there's knowledge in some of these other scales, but I'm just giving them a benefit of doubt. So you can see 0.53 goes to 0.47. Did the same thing on the Woodcock, same thing on the KBC. But look at the interesting thing. The CAS correlates as well as or better than all these other tests, and it doesn't have achievement in it. That's remarkable. This paper just came out. This was a meta-analysis done by George Giorgio and a number of other people. They looked at the relationship between, relationship between PASS and achievement, and they concluded that past theory is more strongly related to achievement than any of the research that's been done on traditional IQ. So whether I gather data or whether these guys gather data, we get the same results. I want to point something out to you. So planning, thinking about how you do what you decide to do. The you decide to do is a critical part of that, right? That's the whole frontal lobe, kind of like executive function thing. You're deciding. Attention, being alert and resisting distraction. That's pretty clear. Simultaneous, getting the big picture, and successive, following a sequence. This is ordinary language. This isn't some kind of psychobabble here. Why is that important? Well, when you sit down with a student and you say, I learned about how you think, and I know you're good at figuring out how to do things, and when you're stuck, you can come up with a plan, and you can attend pretty well and resist the distractions and kind of figure out how things go together, get the big picture. But you really struggle when anything is in a sequence. Well, you just described a complex theory of intelligence to an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. This is very different than if you try to explain fluid intelligence or whatever. You know, so many terms that we use, I think it becomes like psychobabble after a while. This is a very important part of past theory because it's complex, but it's straightforward at the same time. And of course, it's based on the brain. I didn't make this up. J.P. Das and I didn't make this up. This comes from brain research. And what we want to focus on is thinking. That's what the brain does. The knowing is what you've been able to acquire because of your PASS and your experiences. So think of PASS as a theory of learning, because that's really what it is. And we always have to measure thinking separately from knowing. So past theory, I first started working with J.P. Das in 1984. Here's a picture from our first meeting, first time we got together to start to talk about how would we measure intelligence. We knew what we wanted to do. We wanted to start with a theory, which we had, PASS, that was our theory. That's not what Wechsler did. Wechsler just borrowed the Army Alpha and Army Beta, and those guys were pulling in anything they could find that they thought might be effective. The CAS is the only test of intelligence that's ever been built explicitly on a theory of intelligence and one based upon the brain. It's infinitely reasonable and logical to start there. This is what we looked like when we published in '97, the first edition of the CAS. And here we are with the second edition of the CAS. We both aged a bit in that amount of time, but we've been colleagues and friends for a very long time. And we've evolved, both of us. Our thinking has evolved over the many decades that we worked together. When we published the CAS2, I wanted to build it out so that more people could utilize it. So we have the CAS2 brief, which actually a lot of special ed people are using for making decisions about instructional planning. And even teachers are using the rating scale as well. And the traditional 8 and 12 subtest version, but we added the supplementary scales just to kind of better connect to other instruments and other data that you might be getting. And of course, the Spanish edition, which is critically important. So you know how we measure planning, and you know that planning, as I described it before, but it's really more complex than just how you do what you do. because it's all about setting goals and making decisions and predicting what's going to happen. As, of course, impulse control, which is why we often see kids who have ADHD are poor in this particular scale. Strategy, use, retrieval of knowledge. Of course, attention, resistance to distraction. You know, the listening as opposed to hearing. I like that description, really works. Successive processing, all about sequences, whether you hear it, whether you see it, whether you do it, whether you're speaking it, it's all about sequencing. And then, of course, simultaneous, getting the whole, whether it's reading comprehension or whether it's a so-called nonverbal test like this. Think about this for a second. You have on the CAS a nonverbal test of matrices and a verbal test of verbal spatial relations. So that's really contradictory to the verbal and nonverbal thing, because if there was such a thing as verbal intelligence, then that verbal spatial relations test should not be on the same factor as this nonverbal test. Because the reason they are on the same factor is because they both measure the same kind of thinking, how well you can bring things together, understand relationships. That's what they both do, right? Once you start to understand the value of asking the question, how does the student have to think to solve the problem? Then your perspective on what goes together changes in a really powerful way. And then you'll be able to also connect why the student is having trouble in a specific task in the classroom. Oh yeah, it's a math task, but what does it require? It requires a lot of sequencing. Oh yeah, and this reading decoding, well, that requires a lot of sequencing too. And that's how you help the teacher understand better why a child with dyslexia who can't do reading decoding also doesn't know basic math facts, because of the way they're being taught demands successive processing. And it's just like reading decoding does. Once you get down to the brain level, everything changes. Your perspective changes. And this part of the brain is really important, the heteromodal association cortex. Here is where all the modality stuff is stripped away. You know, when I was the age of all of you watching today, I was taught by Rita Dunn, who was a leader in modality-based instruction, visual, auditory, all that kind of stuff. Problem is, it doesn't work. It doesn't really work because that's not how the brain works. The brain doesn't work by modality. The brain works by information after the modality part has been stripped away. And that's why the heteromodal association cortex is such an important thing to know about. Okay, let's move on. We'll have more time to talk about a lot of these other issues. What about social justice? This is really a big issue for me. And I just want to remind you of a couple of things. Let me just take that away so you don't read it. You may have read a lot of people who've done a lot of research on test bias. And they often talk about test bias on the basis of things like factorial invariance, item total correlations different across race groups, p-values across race groups, all the kind of psychometric stuff. And when I read manuals, like some of the manuals that I've seen, it's typical to talk about all the psychometrics and say, look, the test doesn't have any bias. But that leaves out the piece that I'm so pleased that the Standards for Educational Psychological Testing, more recent edition, have emphasized. And here's how this is important. If a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test can be considered unfair because it's penalizing a student because they don't know the answer. In other words, exactly what I've been saying. The student is being penalized on a measure of intelligence because they don't know something, when a test of intelligence should measure how well they think. So this issue of thinking rather than knowing is really critical. So let's just look at a little bit of research. I did research on Hispanic white differences published in the journal Intelligence some years ago on the CAS. We get a small difference. Tulio and I have done several studies where we look at the CAS given in English and Spanish. So you give the same test in the two different languages, you get the same result. Not only do you get the same result and high correlations between the two, you get the same conclusions about what you're going to say if the student has a weakness or a strength. Over 90% of the time, you get the same conclusion. Ultimately, that's the most important thing, right? You could say they're highly correlated, blah, blah, blah. That's fine, but you want to know, are you going to say the same thing regardless of what language you give it in? And that's what happens. Now, looking at tests across black-white comparison, in my Essentials book, I pulled together, this is all the data that's out there. I just put it all here in one place because it's important for you to know. It's important for us to know what we have. And as you can see, traditional IQ tests range from 8 to 13 points. And the KBC is better. I mean, the second study, the match sample study, the KBC, I did that study. I was the only person to ever actually do a black-white study on the KBC. And then look at all the results for the CAS. The smallest difference comes from the CAS2 and the CAS. Because we measure thinking. It's not about what you know. It's about how well you can think and solve problems. That's what this is all about. Now, I'll tell you just quickly, there's an important court case that school psychologists don't know about because it has to do with gifted. But I think it has tremendous implications for us. So you don't need to read all this stuff. I'm going to tell you what it's about. So in this school district in Elgin, Illinois, the population is 43% Hispanic. The gifted program is 3% Hispanic. Seems a little bit out of balance, right? Obviously, it is. For whatever reason, they're not finding these Hispanic kids as gifted. So the parents sued the school, and the Judge Gettleman ruled, after hearing all the testimony, that the district intentionally discriminated against Hispanic students. And the way that they did that is the methods that they used for testing and screening. They gave a COGAT. COGAT is basically a group administered WISC. Comes from the same history. It has verbal stuff and quantitative stuff and nonverbal stuff. And the district required that everyone have high scores on verbal and math to be considered gifted. They gave my Naglieri nonverbal ability test, but the district required that the students have high verbal, even if they had a really high score on my test, the nonverbal test. So they lost. They lost big time, the district did, because it became really obvious to the judge that verbal tests discriminated against Hispanic children in that district. Here's a study that I published almost 20 years ago now. In this study, we had black and white kids all identified as intellectually disabled. I think the term would be used today, right? At the time, it was mental retardation. Here's what we found. For the white kids, the full scale on the WISC and the full scale on the CAS were very similar, but not for the black kids. The black kids, the CAS scores were higher than the WISC scores. But when we looked at the WISC scores, we found that the verbal scale scores for the black kids was much lower than their performance scale scores, whereas the white kids had equal verbal, and performance. So it's very clear that this study showed that the knowledge portion of the Wechsler pulled down the full scales, got these kids who really shouldn't have been put in that class or described in that way misidentified. It's not right. We shouldn't be doing that. All right, a couple of things, and I'll just wrap up, and then we'll just have a free-for-all with other questions. Eligibility determination. That's one of the main things that we do. I'm going to show you a case. This is one of Tulio Otero's cases. This is not really Alejandro. I like just to have a picture of a boy when I show cases. But he was having trouble at school. Teacher thought he might have ADHD because he was not attending and having a little bit of oppositionalism and so on. Here are his scores on the WISC and the KT. Now, of course, there was other information there, but we're just going to focus on this portion here. So, looking at these data, it is reasonable to say, this is a nice boy who's doing the best he can. His intelligence scores are consistent with his academic scores. The only thing is, that's only a reasonable thing to say if you don't know his CAS scores. So this young man has 102 in planning, a 96 in simultaneous, an 84, so that's not so good in successive, but a horrible score of 67 on attention. Are you surprised now that he can't do so many things? No, but now we know it's wrong. This is inattentive type of ADHD, by the way. We have research on this. And a borderline successive score probably related to how long you could concentrate on some of the longer successive processing tasks. So all of a sudden, our view of Alejandro changes very dramatically. He's not doing the best he can. He can do better if we use his simultaneous and planning strengths to overcome his weakness in attention. I've worked with other cases like this. One of the first cases I ever did is actually in my book, Helping Children Learn, the case of Frankie. And when I explained to Frankie a profile pretty much like this, and I told him that he was good in planning and simultaneous and all that, and I told him, but your score on my attention test were really low. He said to me, yeah, that's right. I just can't concentrate. And he actually moved his body and said it that way, And then he said to me, oh, what you're telling me is I'm not stupid. That changed his perspective on himself in a really important way. And I encouraged him to advocate for himself, which he did. And he became so much more successful because of that. Same is true here. Your view of the student changes everything. So, the triangle. You're using the triangle for SLD? So you know how it works? And there's Alejandro. Simple. I just want you to know, I spent months building those things. All the programming, it was worth every second because I think it's great to be able to have those because then you don't have to look up all the tables and all that stuff. And I give it away because I want you all to, have it easy to do that. Otherwise, it's too painful. Oh, here it is. So you know about all these. If you don't know about these, go on my website, take a look at them. But here's the thing. If I'm telling you you should look at the profile of PASS, it's reasonable for you to ask, hey, do you have any research on this that shows it works? Good question. No one ever asked me that. Maybe it's because I preempt it by raising the topic. But I've done this analysis several times to get the same result every time. But let's just look at this. So on this complicated chart, I have profiles that are associated with all the different IQ tests out there. And all these data come from the different test manuals and such. And so you see the WISC-5 and the WISC-4 for ADHD kids doesn't tell you anything. Now, people like Russ Barkley have been saying for years, the WISC doesn't tell you anything about ADHD, even though many people have said it does, it doesn't. The WJ, you get this weird kind of profile, but nothing below 90. The KBC, you don't get anything. But look at the CAS. You get a very distinct profile. So if the KBC really measures planning, you shouldn't have this score here, but you do. Because look how low this score is for kids who have ADHD. This is a collection of research studies, not just one study. So clearly the CAS is detecting the failure to control part of ADHD. Now, is this kind of profile research enough? No. We want to really know about SLD kids, the reading decoding kids, the dyslexic kids especially. Let's look at them next. So we start off with the WISC-5 and the WISC-4. Nothing much except a little low in this working memory, if you really believe that's working memory or not. WJ looks kind of familiar. KBC, flat, nothing, just everything low. That's not helpful. Successive processing, really bad. That makes a lot of sense because reading decoding is about sequencing of sounds. That's the dyslexia. Those kids have a distinctive profile. And when you put these all together, this is where it becomes really interesting. When you put the two sets of profiles on top of one another, you see the WISC-5 and the WISC-4, I don't know, a little bit of this low working memory scale, but wait a second, working memory has digit span forward in it. So that's like successive processing. So that's probably what's pulling that down. It's not about remembering or working with memory or anything like that. Look at how horrible these two profiles are for the woodcock. That means if you're doing CHC, you're not getting differentiation between those kids because woodcock is really so closely aligned with CHC. That's scary. KBC, nothing. But look at the different profiles for the CAS. Clearly different profiles for different people. The CAS is the only. This is all the data that there is, and that's all we know. So clearly, we can do better. And the profile piece is important. And notice we're not looking at subtests because we know subtest profile analysis doesn't work. Paul McDermott, Joe Gluting, Barley Watkins showed that 20 years ago. Doesn't work. I know we're taught to do that. There's no empirical evidence to support it. And so think about how that simplifies your job with the CAS, because you don't have to try to figure out what the subtest measure. In fact, I argue you should never have to do that, because it's the job of the author to tell you what the test measures. It's not your job to try to pick a subtest from here and a subtest from there, put them together and see what they might measure. It's not your job. You shouldn't have to do that. But that's what we've been seeing so much of, too much of, in my opinion. There's too much of that to your job to figure out what the tests to measure. The reason that you have to do that, whether you're doing CHC or the WISC or anything else, is because these tests are not sensitive in the first place, and they don't have a theoretical basis. CHC is really a mathematical perspective, not a theory. It's a mathematical model. The only one here that's built on a theory of brain function is the CAS, and it works because of that. So anyway, there's a lot of profile analysis research I would tell you, take a look at that. And just to remind you, of course, I've talked a lot about intervention already today, but I just want to show you this one study. If you haven't looked at this study, you really should. It's on my website. Notice it's a randomized control study with children with ADHD and LD. Think about that. These are kids who have dual diagnoses. It's a randomized control study. It's showing that what that means is we can say the intervention caused the result. And, you know, the long and short of it is, here's what we found. When you encourage students to be more strategic about how they do what they do, using the method I call planning facilitation, which is a handout in my Helping Children Learn book, they improve in mathematics taken directly from their curriculum more than students who were given more math instruction. And the effect generalizes to standardized achievement tests, Wyatt numerical operation, Woodcock-Johnson math fluency, and it lasted, in this study, a year, because a year later the experimental group was still better than the control group. This is just one little tiny study. We have a whole bunch of studies. J.P. Das has done a whole bunch of studies. There's a lot of research on intervention, the thing that you always want to do. And think about it. All the different authors who provide you these tests or these test interpretations, how many have a book on interventions tied to their theory? I'm the only one. You can get the Helping Children Learn book, which is all about interventions tied to PASS, and they're easy to use. They're intended to be used by the teacher, by the parents, and the student. And I just want to emphasize something. After you give the cast, remember that the most important person you should tell is the student. On that note, I'll say it was a pleasure seeing you all. I hope to see you again. If you ever want to ask me a question, you can always go to my website. Thanks, everybody.